You've probably heard the legend at some point in your life, if you say Bloody Mary 3 times in a mirror, she will appear. But do you actually know who Bloody Mary was? Yes, she was actually a real person in history. And I bet you didn't know that she was a queen, so why don't we dive into her story? Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, I'm Anna. Welcome to Makeup and History, where I combine my love of history and my love of makeup, and we talk about some interesting stories here. We dive into some interesting historical events or people, all while I do my makeup. So please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy it, and also subscribe to my channel. It helps me out a lot, and you can also stay tuned for more episodes just like this one. So let's get started. So Bloody Mary, like I said, she was actually a queen, and I bet you didn't know she was actually Queen Mary of the Tudor Dynasty. Yes, you might know the name Tudor from the two very infamous Tudor monarchs. Her father, Henry VIII, who very famously had 6 wives and killed half of them. Or you might know her famous younger sister, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. But often Mary's reign is looked over. She has a shorter reign, and it's not as talked about. So we're gonna dive into it. Let's start at the beginning. So Mary was born to Henry VIII and his first wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon. Queen Catherine was actually married to Henry VIII's brother for a few months before his brother died and Henry actually took over. And he ended up marrying his sister-in-law, and you might be like, why? Well, she had a very intense claim to the English throne herself, given her family tree. I think they were related. I think they were like third cousins or something. But anyway, she was the first wife of Henry VIII, and Mary was their child. Now, Mary was not the first child to be born from this marriage, but the only one to actually survive. You see, Queen Catherine had a lot of pregnancies, but most of them ended up as stillborns, or they died right after birth. So Mary was the first one to ever make it past infancy, and let me tell you, Catherine and King Henry were very happy about this at first, right? Despite her being a girl, she was actually the apple of her father's eye, and she was considered the heir to the English throne, which was crazy that she might be the first woman to ever rule England in her own right. So she had a very, very lavish upbringing. She was the most sought after woman, even as a child, in the country. So she was the apple of Henry's eye, and she was Catherine's, and Catherine loved her. Like, Catherine was very supportive of her daughter, and she wanted her daughter to have a very royal upbringing. She wanted to make sure her daughter was ready to take on the role of the English monarch, ruler of England. So she gave Mary a very masculine upbringing, and you might be like, Anna, what does masculine upbringing mean? It means Mary was tutored to be a king, you know, as princes usually were. She was given the same education, and so as a woman, she was very lucky at this time to have that, right? She was taught multiple different languages. She was even taught Latin, which was considered a masculine subject, and most women didn't learn it. She even went off to boarding school. She went to the same boarding school her father and his father went to learn how to be kings. So she had a very lavish upbringing. But since she was a woman, it was thought that she would marry a man, perhaps a prince of another country, who would be fit to rule England. So she was actually engaged about 3 times in her young life, yes. By the time she was 9, she had been engaged, and that engagement broken off about 3 times because of her father. Her father got to pick and choose which countries he felt deserved an alliance with England. At one point, she had been engaged to her own 22-year-old cousin. At the age of 5, her 22-year-old cousin, who was actually the Holy Roman Emperor, aka the King of Spain. At this point, you might know Spain is at its peak. It is one of the most, it's an empire. It's huge. It's at its most powerful point, right? But that was so that was broken off, and she then became engaged to the Dauphin of France. That was broken off. And so her father kind of used her as this chess piece. But you see, by the time she was 15, things kind of took a turn for the worse. You see, her father decided that he wanted to divorce her mother. And divorce is a pretty big thing back in the day, especially if it's monarchs and kings and queens doing it. It's not good, because as you might know, the Pope is kind of in charge of everything at this point. You know, the Catholic Church basically runs almost all the countries. And so in order for a king to get a divorce, he has to go through the Pope. But you see, the Pope is kind of under the control of the Holy Roman Empire right now. Spain. It'll be referred to as the Holy Roman Empire throughout this entire video, and just so you know, so you're aware. And of course, Queen Catherine of Aragon is Spanish. She's a Spanish princess, and so the Pope is not willing to give this divorce, right? And Henry is pissed because he is in love with a much, much younger woman. You might know her, Anne Boleyn. And so it's like 5 years of intense turmoil within her family. Her father very publicly and aggressively trying to get rid of Catherine because he wants to be with Anne Boleyn. And he claims all sorts of different things, that he shouldn't have married his brother's wife, that God says in the Bible not to do that, and it was a bad omen, and it was gonna bring down England. You know, God was gonna bring down England if he stayed married to Catherine. He had all sorts of reasons why he needed to divorce her. But we all know the main thing is he really wanted to get with Anne Boleyn. She was way, way younger and way prettier than Catherine. She was pretty old at this point. Not pretty old. She was like in her 40s, right? She was past childbearing ages. She wasn't going to bear him a son. And Henry didn't like that. Henry decides to go beyond the Pope. And he actually separates England from the Catholic Church. And this is huge. This is huge at this point, guys. Like, the Pope, the Catholic Church, it's everything. It runs everything. So Henry, what he does is he actually, he divorces her and makes himself the head of the church. And he is now seen as appointed by God on earth to lead the people the way. He's kind of seen as a different version of the Pope. He's not the Pope, but he is the head of the English church. And this changes the face of nations and countries. Let me tell you, this is big. And so he divorces Catherine, and she is exiled, right? And Anne Boleyn is brought in, and he marries Anne Boleyn. And only a few months after they get married, Elizabeth is born. And Mary is like 17 at this point, right? She is a young woman. She's considered an adult by that standards. And she had just seen her entire life ripped away, okay? She was now declared illegitimate, and she is taken out of the line of succession. And this is really big because she has just spent the majority of her young childhood preparing for queenship, okay? Yeah, she's not happy. She is kept at the castle away from her mother, and she is now made a servant to her young infant half-sister. A lot of resentment grows here. Anne Boleyn was known to be very, very, very cruel to Mary. She was incredibly cruel to Mary. She had her beaten and slapped because Mary refused to give up her title of princess, of the heir to the English throne, and even her mother, Catherine of Aragon, still had a lot of supporters. Queen Catherine had not renounced her queenship. She still considered herself and used the words like, I am the Queen of England. And while this causes a lot of distress to Anne Boleyn, because, well, Anne Boleyn's place is a little rocky, okay? They went against God. They went against the Pope to get their marriage. So Anne Boleyn is not really favored, but she is incredibly cruel to Mary, and this is a huge juxtaposition for Mary. She had a lavish, expensive, educated childhood. She was the most important person in England besides her father, and now she was an illegitimate bastard. And Mary was extremely Catholic. So she was actually, it hurt her because she felt she was going against God, her religion. Her father had just basically excommunicated all of England from the Catholic Church. And this point in Mary's life is probably one of the most important when it comes to how she ends up becoming, who she ends up becoming as a person. This time in her life really sticks with her. It is one of the worst times in her life because her and her mother are kept separated from each other, okay? She only sees her mother once in 5 years for a very brief period, and then her mother dies. And Mary is overcome with she is distraught. She doesn't know what to do. And she contacts her cousin, the Emperor of Spain, and she's like, I want to come to Spain. I gotta leave. I can't be here. And so she had planned to go to Spain, but then something happens just after her mother's death. Anne Boleyn is arrested, tried with adultery, and executed. And her half-sister, who was the heir of England, was actually now a bastard, just like Mary. And Mary actually decides not to go to Spain. She's like, wait, hold on a second. I can get back into my father's good graces. This is the time. Anne Boleyn is gone. I can now reconnect with my father. And so she writes to her father and she's like, Dad, please let me back in the family, basically. And Henry is just not a good father. He's just not a good dad. And he's basically like, no, I'm not going to let you back into the family because you're Catholic. And he's now Protestant. He's now head of the Protestant church. He has renounced his Catholic ways. He is now head of the church. Mary is still extremely Catholic. And that's a big no-no for Henry. Mary is a threat at this point because there's still Catholic people in England who don't like that Protestantism is now in control, basically. So he says, the only way I'll let you back into the family, you must renounce your Catholic ways. You must say, I am the head of the church, not the Pope, and you must admit that mine and your mother's marriage was illegitimate. It wasn't real. Mary's like, I can't do that. That goes against my conscience, my God, my morals. And then Henry's basically like, okay, well, if you don't sign this paper saying you renounce all this, I'm gonna kill you. And Mary knows that he's not bluffing. He just murdered his wife. He just killed his wife, who he changed the course of nations, the course of history to be with. Yeah, he would kill his own daughter. So she signs it. And she is not happy with herself, but she signs it. Despite this being against her own conscience, despite this being a huge moral choice for Mary, she actually ends up having the next decade being probably the most peaceful decade of her life. You see, her father married Jane Seymour and had a son, Edward. Oh, that's all Henry wanted. And finally, he had his son and he was happy. So Mary was no longer a threat and she got to live at the castle with her half-sister and her half-brother. And while she hated her sister, she loved her brother. She adored Edward. She was even his godmother. In 1547, Henry dies. Hallelujah. 6 wives later, Henry dies, and she's relieved because her father put a lot of pressure on her, right? And really did not like her because she was the only Catholic child of his. Edward is now the king, and he's only 10, I believe, at this point. He's very young. He's not considered... He is the king, but a privy council rules kind of for him. He's kind of only king in name. And for the first year of Edward's reign, it's pretty peaceful for Mary. Her father had left her in his will. He had left her a large estate in England, one of the largest estates, and she becomes one of the richest landowners in the country. She was put back in his will. He put her back in the line of succession. It now goes Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. She's still a bastard, but she's now considered an heir, you know, and she's a very rich landowner, but because of her weird status still as an illegitimate, she remains unmarried. You know, she's in her 30s at this point, and she remains unmarried, and it's weird because at this point, she's considered like an old spinster because she's 30 and not married. Because most women got married at like 14 at this point. Like even I as a 22-year-old, if I was not married at this point, they'd be like, what the heck is wrong with her? She's not married with kids. And so Mary's in this weird state. But you see, the first year of Edward's reign goes okay. She has her land and everything, and then Edward does something. Edward decides, when I mean Edward, I mean his privy council, basically. Because remember, he's like a 10-year-old. They want to radicalize. They want to really elevate the Protestant status. Now remember, at this time, Protestants and Catholics really don't get along. They're kind of seen as two completely different religions, which nowadays you might be like, what? Two different religions? But at the time, Protestants and Catholics saw each other as like completely different. Completely different. And they didn't get along, and it for hundreds of years, caused a ton of turmoil, right? Edward wants to basically ban Catholicism. They want to make England a 100% Protestant nation, because they still had a very heavy Catholic influence, and they wanted to get rid of it. You see, Mary is extremely devout, and she was known to go to Mass 4 times a day. And from the moment she got up to the moment she went to bed, she was seen in church praying and praying and praying and attending Mass and service. Like, she was extremely devout. And you see, that caused a problem because people were pissed that Edward had basically banned their religion, banned Catholicism. Mary can become a figurehead here for a Catholic cause. So what Edward realizes is that my sister can probably become a figurehead. So I can't physically ban her from worship, from her religion. So what he does is he allows Mary to continue her Catholic ways, but she now must worship in private. She has her own private little church within her own grounds. Yeah, Mary doesn't really like it, right? She doesn't like it, and she's like, I can't stay here, right? She wants to go to Spain. She wants to go to Spain to where her only kind of, her only ally, which is her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles. So she contacts Charles and she's like, I gotta get out of here. I can't live in a Protestant country. It goes against God, you know, it's wrong. To her, it's wrong. There's a lot of contact back and forth, and eventually Charles is like, okay, come to Spain. He sends ships her way. Of course, they take a little while to get there because, you know, travel back then is very slow. But she has a head of household and like an advisor, since she is a royal person. And her advisor is like, you shouldn't leave, right? The ships are arriving. She is freaked out. She is grabbing things out of her house. She's getting ready to leave. She's questioning if she's making the right choice. And her head of household is like, do not go. He's like, here's the thing. The boy King Edward is, his horoscope says he's gonna die within the year. And if you are in exile, you might lose your chance to be queen if he dies. Which, that would probably, you know, this is all Mary has wanted, like her whole life. She just wants to be Queen of England because that was her birthright, right? She was born to be the Queen of England. So she is like, she doesn't know what to do. She's praying. The imperial ships of Spain have been spotted. She might get arrested if she gets on. She might get arrested if she doesn't. It's very conflicting. But she decides to stay. She does. She decides to stay, and what do you know? That horoscope ends up being right. Edward dies just a few years after his father did. But here's the problem. Edward, even though he was sick and on his deathbed at the age of 15 at this point, he was like, I can't let Mary be queen because she is Catholic. He is Protestant. He doesn't want a Catholic ruler basically ruining all the work he just did, right? So what does he do? And you might be like, oh, he makes his sister, his Protestant sister Elizabeth, who's in line to be queen anyway. Oh, he just skips over Mary and goes straight to Elizabeth, right? Wrong. He goes to a completely different woman. He picks a woman, which was surprising. But not one of his sisters. He picks a woman named Jane Grey. And Jane Grey is his cousin. Jane Grey becomes queen on the 6th of July. She becomes known as the 9 Days Queen. Come the 13th of July, Jane is ripped off the throne and Mary is placed upon it. Protestants and Catholics alike are actually very happy. People sing in the streets, and at age 37, Mary finally becomes the Queen of England. 37 is considered pretty old at this point, right? And like I said, Mary was unmarried, which was weird, and now she faced another issue, and that is the issue of an heir. It's the whole issue her father went through, and what caused her such turmoil. She needs to get married and produce an heir ASAP. So she's starting to think, oh, who is worthy enough to marry? As the Queen of England, as one of the first, well, technically Jane Grey was the first woman to rule in her own right, lasted 9 days. Mary's kind of actually the first to rule within her own right as Queen of England. And so she needs to now find a husband who is worth her while. One that is good enough to be married to the Queen of England, the ruler of England. The Holy Roman Empire, Charles, her cousin, is her greatest ally, and he suggests, hey, why don't you marry my only son, Philip, her like second cousin. And she's like, okay, and so she meets Philip, and it is like love at first sight for Mary, not for Philip. And she is like smitten with him. It's described that she like basically turns into a teenager, like a giggling teenager, and like is just so smitten and in love with him. She's finally getting married, you know. She finally, like, she gets to pick her own husband, which is probably why she's so giddy, because usually women don't get to pick their own husbands. And she is, like, obsessed with Philip. She's like, oh my god, the love of my life, I love him so much, he's great. Philip doesn't really like Mary. She's considered old, like I said, which 37 isn't that old, but again, they're like the same age, and most of the time, men especially back then, married much terrifyingly younger women. But they get married because, like, she is the Queen of England, and remember, Spain is like this huge empire. They want to control everything, as empires do, so they get married. And this is not a popular thing. The people of England are really pissed off because they don't want a Spanish king. Because, again, Spain controls, like, everything. And they're like, we don't want to fall under Spain like everyone else. So they're not entirely happy about this. And even her privy council is like, Mary, what are you doing? Like, don't marry him. And she's like, I'm going to marry him. So she marries him. It's a very unpopular opinion. They don't like it. No one really likes it. Just a little bit after they get married, Mary falls pregnant. Yay! An heir, thank God. Because you know how much trouble heirs cause, especially in the Tudor Dynasty, for goodness sake. Well, she gets pregnant. She's overjoyed. She's so happy. She starts her reign. The first year of her reign it's relatively peaceful. It's okay. She's pretty forgiving of the Protestant people. She does put Catholicism back in place, but she's forgiving. She's kind, you know? And that's, you know, that's a pretty decent quality, right? Well, she gets pregnant, you know, she's so overjoyed, she's growing, she's showing, she's feeling the baby kick. 9 months later, nothing happens. She's like, oh, it's probably a delayed pregnancy. 10 months go by, nothing happens. 11 months go by and it becomes clear, she wasn't pregnant. It was a phantom pregnancy. Now, this wasn't completely uncommon. I mean, given medical history and what they really understood about women's bodies at that time, it was pretty common to have like a phantom pregnancy. And so she has one, and Philip leaves and goes back to Spain because he's like, oh, she's not having a kid? Okay, I'm leaving. Like, he's really not in this marriage, guys. He just wants England. He does not want Mary. He does not like Mary. He's not into Mary. And so her husband leaves and she has no child. And she sees this as a sign from God, as a punishment, that she has been far, far, far too lenient with the Protestants in her country. And that she needs to cleanse England. She needs to cleanse the land, purify it. Which, anytime a leader uses the word purify, that's pretty bad news. It's not good. So this begins the absolute reign of terror of just prosecuting Protestants. And it starts when there's a Protestant uprising. You know, they want to try and get Mary off the throne, and they want to put Elizabeth on it. Now, Elizabeth doesn't endorse this, but it is in the name of Elizabeth. And it's led by Thomas Wyatt, and let me tell you, it does not go well. It ends up getting shut down very quickly. But Mary now has her eye on Elizabeth. Elizabeth is imprisoned in the Tower of London. Elizabeth ends up being innocent in all this, but she now has her eye on her younger sister, and she is now angry. The Protestants don't want her on the throne. She starts executing. She starts with the leaders of the Thomas Wyatt rebellion. She starts with them, but it's not enough for Mary, you see. And it starts in February of 1555. Mary decides she needs to execute people. And the thing is, Mary doesn't execute, you think, oh, executions. Probably like beheaded. That's a classic that her father really endorsed, really liked. You know, hanging, that's very popular. What does she do? She's like, no. We're gonna burn people. And burning had it wasn't outlawed, but previous rulers had decided against it because it was kind of considered an inhumane way to kill people. It also took a lot of resources. Like, you had to gather the pyre and all that stuff. You know, beheading and hanging was just easier, and it was quicker, and it wasn't as inhumane. It was believed that the only way to get rid of, you know, to appease God, to get rid of the heretics, was to burn them. That was the only way to do it, because it would send them, like, straight to hell. So she starts burning people. There's a classic story that comes from these burnings. It's the story of the Archbishop Cranmer. He was very well known. He had a lot of followers. And he was, at this point, he was an old man. He had been, you know, a Protestant leader since he was young. He was an old man, and he watched a lot of his fellow colleagues burn, right? He watched a lot of them burn, and he was like, you know, burning is incredibly painful, right? You watch as your lower body burns off, and it takes a long time to kill you, and it's painful. So he's an old man at this point, and he's like, this is really not the way I want to go out, and I really don't blame him. But people are kind of shocked when one of the heads of the Protestant church decides, in order to save himself from the pyre, he's like, I'm going to recant. I'm going to renounce my Protestant ways, tell Mary I'm going to become a Catholic, and she won't burn me. Wrong. First of all, Mary's like, haha, I got you to sign this. Now the Protestants don't like you, but I'm gonna burn you anyway. And this was a really bad move. This was a really bad move on Mary's part because Cranmer does something. As he walks to the pyre and everyone's like watching, as he gets to the pyre, he lights his hand on fire. The hand he signed the document that recants his Protestantism. He burns it in a very dramatic way and kind of says like, let me burn in hell for giving up the true ways of God. And he becomes a huge martyr for the Protestant people. Mary just gave them a reason to rally, and Mary burns about 300 people. This is huge. This is a huge crusade against the Protestants that is led by a ruler, right? This is incredibly bloody, and people are constantly being burned. But you see, that doesn't diminish them. It gives them hope. It gives them belief that they are right because they are the underdog. They are burning for their love of God. Mary really shouldn't do this. Her Privy Council tells her time and time again, you really shouldn't be doing this. You really shouldn't be doing this. Like, because it causes a lot of revolts. People are willing to revolt against Mary because she's doing this. And you have to wonder why, with even her Privy Council and such, that she kept doing this, despite them constantly being like, Mary, don't do this. And perhaps that was because of her childhood. That in her eyes, Protestantism kind of ruined her childhood because her father turned to it to divorce her mother and thus created all the hardship for her that she believes she never should have had. With all these issues in England at the moment, Philip, her husband, comes back to England to kind of try and seem like they're in a united front. And while he's there, Mary believes she falls pregnant finally once again. And so it's now late 1556. And Mary believes she's pregnant and that perhaps because of what she was doing, the killing of the heretics, aka the Protestants, that she could finally have an heir and the baby she's always wanted. So the baby was due in early 1557. And again, come that time, there is absolutely no baby. Right now, there is a rampaging influenza that is tearing through England and all of Europe, really. And well, Mary falls incredibly sick after what was supposed to be the birth of her child, which again, we believe she had another false pregnancy, and she grows incredibly ill. And so she grows sicker and sicker between May of 1557 through November of 1557. She grows increasingly ill and she is on her deathbed. She has to name an heir. And of course, you know, people are like, well, why doesn't her husband, King Philip, take over because he's a man? Well, and the English people don't want that. So Mary has to choose. She has to pick. And of course, she does not want England to go back into Protestantism, but what choice does she have? Just days before she passes, she names her half-sister, her much younger half-sister, Elizabeth, to be the Queen of England, and then she passes. One of the last requests she makes is that she be buried with her mother. Unfortunately, her sister Elizabeth does not honor this, and she is actually buried in Westminster Abbey, in a place she would later share a tomb with the half-sister who she hated. We believe now, as we look back on Mary's life, that perhaps her false pregnancies and even her death was actually a result of either uterine or ovarian cancer. Mary died at the age of 42, which was actually considered a young death even at that point. So we definitely think she was struggling from something. Mary had a rather short life and an even shorter reign, and it was filled with sorrow, resentment, and hatred. Mary is often forgotten because of her famous father and his 6 wives, and also her younger sister who came right after her as being considered one of the best ever rulers of England. The legacy she left was probably not one she ever meant to leave, probably one she never wanted, but she became known as Bloody Mary, a queen that was controlled by a cold heart, cruelness, and this hope that she could make up for the life she wished she had. She became known as Bloody Mary because of her cruel and very aggressive attack on the Protestant people, her taste and lust for blood in order to rectify what she believed had gone wrong in her life, that Protestantism had what caused her father to abandon her mother, her to go through such hardships, and her not to be named Queen of England far earlier than she was. She would now, and perhaps forever, be known as Bloody Mary, the Forgotten Tudor Queen. And that is the story of Bloody Mary. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I really like this makeup look I came up with as I was telling you this fantastic story. In case you ever want to know what makeup products I am using, I will link them down in the description below in case you see something you like and want to pick up for yourself. And please give this video a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. And also subscribe to my channel. It helps out my tiny little channel a lot, and it also means you can stay tuned for more episodes just like this. Trust me, there is a lot more coming, and I really hope you liked this story. And yeah, have a good day.